When my landlady smiled and said I owed her more than rent, I thought she was joking, until I realized she
Well,
wanted
it
something
seems you've
far
made
deeper
quite
than
an
money.
impression already.
When I first carried my suitcase up the worn stone steps of that suburban house, I thought I was only renting a room. Nothing more. A place to sleep, to regroup, to figure out where I was headed in life. What I didn't expect was her, my landlady. She opened the door herself, a woman of 42 with a calm grace that immediately unsettled me. Her hair, chestnut brown, was loosely tied back, a few strands framing her face. She wore a cream silk blouse tucked neatly into dark jeans, the kind of outfit that looked effortless yet deliberate. There was something in the way she held herself, not stiff, not overly friendly, but quietly certain, as though she'd seen enough of life to know who she was and no longer needed to prove anything. Her smile was warm but measured, not the overly rehearsed kind you'd expect from someone greeting a stranger. "You must be Daniel," she said, her voice steady, low, carrying a natural authority softened by kindness. I nodded, suddenly aware of how young I must have looked to her, 25 and uncertain, shifting the strap of my bag awkwardly on my shoulder. The house smelled faintly of fresh lilies, the kind of detail most people overlook but somehow fit her. She stepped aside, allowing me in, and as I passed, I caught the faint trace of her perfume, subtle, floral, lingering just enough to make me wonder what it was. We walked through the hallway as she explained the rules of the house. Nothing demanding, nothing unreasonable, but even in her tone, I felt the unspoken weight of someone who commanded respect. When she spoke, I found myself listening not just to her words but to the pauses between them, the slight curve of her lips when she glanced at me. In the living room, sunlight poured through tall windows, touching her skin in a way that made me notice details I shouldn't have noticed, the graceful line of her jaw, the faint crease by her eyes that only made her expression richer. She caught me staring once, and instead of looking away quickly, she tilted her head slightly, as though she was already used to being noticed, as though she had anticipated it. I set my suitcase by the stairs, and for a brief moment, the silence stretched. She didn't fill it with chatter, she simply studied me, her arms crossed lightly, her expression unreadable. It wasn't cold. It wasn't overly welcoming either. It was something else entirely. A kind of curiosity. That was the moment I realized, this wouldn't just be a place to stay. There was a story already forming between us, invisible yet undeniable, written in glances, gestures, and the quiet understanding that sometimes two people meet not by accident, but by timing neither of them asked for, and neither of them could walk away from. Living under her roof changed the rhythm of my days in ways I didn't expect. At first, I treated the house like a place to pass through, eat, sleep, leave. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, her presence began to shape the quiet spaces of my life. She had this way of checking in without making it feel intrusive. Some mornings, I would step into the kitchen and find a small vase of fresh flowers placed on the counter. Sometimes daisies, sometimes lilies, once even roses from the garden outside. When I asked if she'd put them there, she simply smiled and said, "A house should never feel empty." I began to notice how she managed the home with a delicate balance of grace and control. Her books were lined neatly on the shelves in the living room, everything in its place yet still lived in. There was always a soft throw draped over the couch, a candle lit in the evenings, the scent of vanilla and cedar weaving through the air. Each detail reflected her, and with every passing day, I felt more like I was stepping into her world than just renting a room. It was in the small moments that something stirred between us. When she leaned across the table to pour coffee, her arm brushed lightly against mine, and though it lasted no more than a second, I carried the warmth of that touch far longer than I should have. Or the evenings when I'd hear her humming faintly while tending to the garden, her voice low and soothing, almost like she was speaking to herself. I found myself lingering by the window, listening. One evening, I came home later than usual. My shoulders were heavy with exhaustion, my mood darkened by the day. She noticed the moment I stepped inside. "Rough day?" she asked gently, leaning against the kitchen counter. I nodded, and before I could say anything more, she opened a cupboard and pulled out a teapot, setting it on the stove. Sit. Tea fixes more than people give it credit for. I sat, and for the next 20 minutes, I listened to her talk about nothing in particular, the garden soil, a book she was reading, the weather forecast. Yet in that ordinary conversation, I felt my body ease, my breathing slow. Her presence grounded me in a way I didn't expect. I started realizing that it wasn't just the house I was relying on, it was her. The comfort of her voice when the silence of the night felt too heavy. The way she seemed to notice when I needed space, and when I needed company. She became the quiet anchor of my unsettled life, though neither of us said it out loud. And still, beneath all of this warmth, there lingered something unspoken. A pause too long when our eyes met. A smile that carried meaning neither of us acknowledged. The line between kindness and something deeper was beginning to blur, and we both knew it. It happened on a Tuesday evening, the kind of night that carried a hush, as though the whole neighborhood had gone still. I had just returned home, shoulders tight from a long day, when I noticed a warm glow spilling out from the kitchen. She was there, sitting at the table with a teapot and 2 cups, as if she had been waiting. "You're back later than usual," she said softly, her eyes following me as I dropped my keys onto the counter. "Come, have some tea. You look like you need it." Her tone wasn't commanding. It was an invitation, gentle yet impossible to refuse. I pulled out the chair across from her, the wood creaking beneath me, and for the first time, I really looked at her without rushing. The dim golden light of the overhead lamp softened every line of her face, turning what might have been weariness into elegance. At first, we spoke about small things, the weather, the books on her shelves, the sound of the rain beginning to patter softly against the window. But as the tea warmed my hands, the conversation shifted. She asked about my work, my plans, my uncertainty about the future. I told her more than I expected to, my words tumbling out easily in the quiet safety she created. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience. She told me about her divorce, about the silence of the house when she first returned to it alone, about how it had taken years to rebuild herself. Her honesty didn't make her seem fragile, it made her seem real. A woman who had lived, who had lost, and who had chosen to keep moving forward. There was a moment, somewhere between my confession of doubt and her quiet admission of loneliness, when the air shifted. Our eyes met, and the silence was no longer empty, it pulsed with something unspoken. I reached across the table, meaning only to take the sugar jar, but her fingers brushed mine before I could pull away. It was the lightest of touches, accidental, yet neither of us moved. For a heartbeat, her hand lingered, warm against my skin, her eyes searching mine as though asking a question she didn't voice. We both drew back a second later, pretending it hadn't happened. But the truth was undeniable, in that silence, in that brief connection, a line had been crossed. Not with words, not with declarations, but with the quiet electricity of 2 people realizing they were no longer just landlady and tenant. That night, when I went upstairs to my room, I could still feel her touch on my hand, faint but unforgettable, a reminder that something had shifted, and there would be no going back. After that evening in the kitchen, nothing between us looked the same, though outwardly, everything remained unchanged. She was still my landlady, and I was still her tenant. Yet the silence carried more weight. Every glance, every shared space seemed to hum with something unspoken. When I handed her the envelope with rent that weekend, our fingers brushed just as they had over the sugar jar. Only this time, it wasn't accidental. She could have taken the envelope quickly, but she didn't. Her fingers lingered against mine for the briefest pause, just long enough to remind me of that night at the kitchen table. Her smile was polite, but her eyes betrayed her. They softened, lingered, as though she knew the effect she had on me. In the hallway, our paths crossed more often than coincidence allowed. She would step closer than necessary when passing, her shoulder grazing mine, her perfume trailing behind her like a whisper I couldn't ignore. She'd tilt her head when speaking to me, eyes holding mine just a moment longer than normal conversation required. Each gesture was small enough to be explained away, yet together, they built a quiet storm neither of us acknowledged aloud. One evening, she asked me to help fix a light bulb in the living room. I climbed the small ladder while she steadied it, her hands resting lightly on the sides. From above, I caught the angle of her face as she looked up, her lips parted slightly, her expression softer than I'd ever seen it. When I came down, she didn't step back right away. For a moment, we stood close, almost too close, the distance between us thinner than breath. But she broke the tension with casual words. "Thank you," she said, her tone smooth, though her eyes flickered in a way that betrayed her calm. I only nodded, my voice caught somewhere between restraint and longing. What unsettled me most was how natural it felt, this quiet pull between us. It wasn't forced. It wasn't reckless. It was as if the house itself conspired to bring us nearer, the narrow kitchen counter where we brushed past each other, the shared armrest on the couch when we both sat down, the long pauses in conversation when silence said more than words. To anyone outside, we were no more than a woman renting out a room to a younger man. But inside those walls, every look, every pause, every accidental touch carried the weight of secrets neither of us dared to speak. And yet, I knew, the silence couldn't hold forever. Something had to give. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind where the world outside seemed drowsy with sunlight. I had just finished mowing the small patch of grass in the front yard, a favor I'd taken upon myself, though part of me knew I was doing it to earn her smile. When I stepped back inside, my shirt clung to me with sweat, and I found her in the living room, folding laundry with a kind of calm precision. She glanced up, her eyes flicking over me before resting on my face. That look alone sent something restless through me. Then she smiled, not the polite smile she often gave, but one with edges, teasing, deliberate. "You know," she said, folding the last towel with slow care, "I think you owe me more than just rent." The words hung in the air, light yet charged. My heart kicked hard against my chest. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. But no, she was watching me closely, her expression playful, her voice laced with something deeper. I forced a laugh, though my throat was dry. "More than rent?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes," she replied, her tone low, her smile unshaken. She set the towel aside and leaned back against the couch, arms crossed loosely, as if waiting to see how I would respond. The way she looked at me then, confident, challenging, yet with a flicker of vulnerability hiding in her eyes, it was as though she was daring me to step into a truth we'd both been circling around for weeks. I stood there, caught between hesitation and instinct. 100 thoughts rushed through me, the roles we played, the risks, the invisible line I'd told myself not to cross. But all of them collapsed under the weight of her gaze. Instead of retreating, I stepped closer, until the space between us felt charged with heat. My voice came out steady, though my pulse was racing. "Then take what you want." Her breath caught, almost imperceptibly, but I noticed. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes locked on mine. The playful smile softened into something else, something more fragile, more human. She didn't move right away. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of my words settle. In that moment, we both knew something irreversible had happened. The line we'd pretended to keep intact was gone, dissolved with a few simple words. And yet, instead of claiming what she wanted right away, she only gave the faintest smile, almost shy beneath her composure. "Careful," she murmured, her voice quiet but trembling at the edges. "I just might." The days after that moment felt different. The air between us carried a quiet charge, like the stillness before a summer storm. Nothing was spoken directly, yet everything seemed to be said in the pauses, in the looks that lingered too long, in the closeness that neither of us pulled away from anymore. One evening, I found her sitting on the couch in the living room, a glass of wine resting lightly in her hand. The lamps cast a soft amber glow across the room, painting her face in shadows that made her look both strong and fragile. She glanced up when I entered, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "Long day?" she asked, her voice smooth, but there was an undertone, as if she were asking something else entirely. "Too long," I admitted, dropping into the seat beside her. Our shoulders brushed, and neither of us shifted to create space. Instead, the silence grew warm, familiar, heavy with something unspoken. For a while, we just sat there. She swirled her wine slowly, her eyes fixed on the glass, but her body leaned just slightly toward mine. I could feel her nearness, the faint warmth radiating from her arm against mine. My chest tightened with anticipation, with the delicate ache of restraint. Then, almost cautiously, she set her glass aside. Her hand rested on her lap, inches from mine, fingers curling and uncurling as though debating a choice. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply waited. Finally, she reached over, her hand finding mine with a gentleness that made my breath catch. Her fingers slipped around mine, hesitant at first, then firm, her thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. It wasn't bold. It wasn't hurried. It was careful, deliberate, as though she needed to know I welcomed it. I turned my palm upward, holding her hand fully. She exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing, and for the first time, the guarded confidence she always carried gave way to something far more vulnerable. She leaned into me, her head resting lightly against my shoulder. My chest rose and fell under her touch, my heartbeat uneven but steady enough for her to notice. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The simple weight of her against me, the warmth of her hand in mine, said more than words could. In that quiet, I understood, this wasn't about rent, or roles, or even temptation. It was about two people who had been holding pieces of loneliness for too long, finally finding someone who could share the weight. And so, in that small, tender moment, a line wasn't just crossed, it was erased. Morning light spilled through the tall windows, soft and golden, carrying with it the quiet promise of a new beginning. I came downstairs to find her already in the kitchen, hair tied loosely, dressed in a simple robe that only made her look more graceful, more at ease. The coffee pot was steaming, and the smell filled the air, warm and comforting. She looked up as I entered, and for a moment, we didn't say anything. Her smile was small but full of meaning, the kind of smile that held an entire conversation inside it. She poured a cup of coffee, set it on the counter, and slid it toward me without a word. I took it, fingers brushing hers in the process, and felt the familiar current between us, but it no longer carried the sharp edge of uncertainty. Instead, it was steady, settled, like a river that had finally found its course. We sat at the small table, the quiet clinking of cups filling the silence. She glanced at me, eyes soft, and asked casually, "Did you sleep well?" It was such an ordinary question, yet in her tone, in the way her gaze lingered on mine, it felt like more. It felt like we had moved past the unspoken tension, into something that no longer needed to be denied. "Yes," I answered, and then, after a pause, added quietly, "Better than I have in a long time." Her smile deepened. She reached across the table, resting her hand over mine, and I covered it with my other hand, anchoring the moment. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet certainty of two people who had chosen each other in a world that might not understand, but didn't need to. She sighed softly, almost as if releasing a weight she had carried for years. "It's been a long time since this house felt alive," she admitted. Her words were simple, but the way she looked at me, steady, vulnerable, open, made my chest tighten with something more than desire. In that morning light, it became clear, what we had wasn't about secrets or forbidden lines anymore. It was about trust, about companionship, about finally allowing ourselves to want something real. We finished our coffee in easy silence, the kind that only comes when words are no longer necessary. And when I rose to leave for the day, she touched my arm lightly, stopping me, her eyes meeting mine with quiet certainty. "No matter what this looks like to anyone else," she said softly, "it's ours." And in that moment, I knew she was right. What began as rent and rules had turned into something far deeper, something neither of us had expected, but both of us had chosen.